Recently, the Federal Reserve announced a rate cut of 0.50% to their benchmark federal funds rate, and this is the first cut of interest rates since the Fed began increasing them back during the pandemic. Because of this, the interest rates on mortgages have also fallen, so according to this article, quote, the average rate on a 30-year mortgage slips to 6.08%, the lowest level in 2 years, and this is according to Freddie Mac. Now, to give you guys some context, the average 30-year mortgage rate just a year ago was 7.31%. So with rates dropping and demand for homes slowly ticking upwards, should you actually act now or wait for potential further rate decreases? The Fed has hinted that they will cut interest rates at least one more time this year, with the traders predicting that the Fed may cut rates another 0.5%, 0.75%, or even 1% more this year alone. So today we're going to discuss the impact of interest rates on home prices, the pros and cons of buying now versus waiting, and what I'm personally doing since I am in the market for a home in the next year or so. And by the end of this video, you should be equipped with enough knowledge to have some actionable takeaways based on what's going on in the market. First, let's talk about how just a 0.5% drop in interest rates actually translates to a real amount of savings on a typical mortgage. I think so many people just see 0.5% and they don't really understand the gravity of what that means for their wallets. It doesn't sound like a huge number, but it will actually translate to a huge amount of savings. So we're going to take this home right here outside of Chicago that's listed for $500,000. It's a nice 3-bed, 3-bath, 2380 square feet. It sounds and looks pretty nice and lots of room for activities, right?
So many activities!
Like personally, I feel like you could probably build a golf simulator in there if you're into that kind of thing, or perhaps a wine cellar, you know, whatever you want. Let's pretend you put 20% down or $100K in cash on this house. That means you need a mortgage of $400,000 to fill up the difference in order to buy the home. If the interest rate on this mortgage is 6.5%, we're looking at an average payment of around $29.23 per month in order to pay off this home over 30 years. The total amount of interest paid on this loan will be $510,178. So that's right, the total price of the house is $500K, but the total interest that you pay is actually more than the list price of the home that when you buy it. I think that's the pretty crazy thing about mortgages and big loans, is that the interest can really add up over time. With a 0.50% drop in a mortgage interest rate, your payment is now $27.93 a month, or $130 cheaper per month. The total amount of interest that you're going to pay on this loan over the course of 30 years is $463,353. That means just a 0.50% interest rate difference on the same mortgage is literally going to save you $46,825 over the course of the loan compared to the scenario earlier. So this illustrates that any interest rate drop in the future could really bring down the cost of owning a home over the course of your lifetime. And this is something that always surprised me about home ownership and buying a home in general, which is that people should probably spend more time up front trying to lock in a lower mortgage rate by shopping around for those rates, much like you would shop around for a car rate or a home insurance rate. We'll talk about some ways on how you can shop around a little later on in this video, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Now, historically, a 6% average interest rate for a 30-year loan is still somewhat high compared to what it has been in the past 10 years, according to the Federal Reserve graph, as you can see right here. And while it is no longer at its peak in the past 10 years, what I did find fascinating was that the historical average 30-year mortgage rate in the US for the past 53 years is 7.74%. That means current interest rates already are below historical averages, but we have to remember that a lot of the historical rate is being pulled upwards because of the super high interest rates that were in the 80s. Famously, the rates in the 80s got upwards of 15 to even 20% for a mortgage at the time. So while our current rates are still lower than historical averages, it's still elevated compared to what it's been in the past 10 years, but at least it's on a downtrend. Now, before we talk about rate predictions and what the economists actually think, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this channel. I know that you probably hear a lot of YouTubers asking for that, and it was definitely the weirdest thing that I had to get used to when I started making videos, but it turns out the data shows that asking does help. So please subscribe, and I love you. All right, so are rates actually going to come down further in 2025 to the point where it makes a lot more sense to buy a house then? Well, that depends. First, we still need the Fed to actually cut interest rates. Now, according to a recent poll by Readers, which surveyed 101 economists, they actually found that 89 of them expected the Fed might lower rates by another 0.25% or even 0.5% by the year end. And in 2025, it's rather unpredictable. I mean, the Fed will either have to cut rates due to, let's say, preventing a recession if economic and job data starts to look bad, or they just might hold rates steady. According to a 2024 survey by Readers, I think a different one, economists believe that the Fed will continue cutting rates once per quarter in 2025 until the federal funds rate lands around 3.75 to 4%. Now, hypothetically speaking, if that's the target rate in 2025, that represents a 1% difference from where we are right now. Of course, that would increase the chances that it would in turn lower mortgage rates, but the problem is that the federal rate cuts are pretty hard to predict once you start getting 6 or 12 months out. Other factors to keep an eye on that affect mortgage rates, especially in America, include supply and demand, as well as unemployment. For housing supply, according to the National Association of Realtors, there were 1.35 million homes for sale by the end of August, which was up 0.7% from a month prior, and that inventory level was up 22.7% compared with August of 2023. But this is still lower than the pandemic inventory levels we were seeing of 1.8 million homes for sale per month. More housing supply, if there's no demand for it, will create more of a competitive market for mortgage rates, so we could see that in 2025, but still that's something we need to keep an eye on. Now, for unemployment, Freddie Mac published in August that, quote, the unemployment rate ticked up further to 4.3% and remains at its highest level since November of 2021. And that means historically higher unemployment will usually mean lower demand for housing, which means that lenders could have to adjust their rates because they need to give a little bit because not everybody is just kind of flush with cash. So now that we know the impact of mortgage rates on affordability, as well as the predictions for further rate cuts in 2025, what are some of the pros and cons of buying a house now versus waiting? For buying now, here are the pros. So the first pro of buying now is that you lock in the price of a home that you are eyeing. We don't know what will happen with housing prices as soon as mortgage rates fall further, and it could be possible that as mortgage rates fall, that demand will outstrip supply. This will cause prices to increase and ultimately make it really hard to own a home. Pro number 2 is that you could lock in a 5.5 to 6% mortgage rate right now, which is historically lower than the average for the past 53 years. What I said earlier in the video is that you should definitely shop around for rates, and a 0.5 to even a 1% lower interest rate than the national average 30-year rate is possible through brokers that can possibly get you a wholesale mortgage. For example, United Wholesale Mortgage typically offers these, but you can't directly go to them because they are just a wholesale supplier of mortgages. Instead, you have to go through a broker. So I personally had a friend of mine lock in a 5.5% rate last week through a website like this one, directwholesale.com. Many brokers like this should shop around for the best rate for you. I'll leave a link down below for this one in particular, or you could just ask your realtor or lender if they have access to wholesale mortgage rates. At the very minimum, you want to at least shop your rate around, at least with retail banks as well as wholesale. Just don't settle for the first rate that you hear because usually the first rate that you get is not always the best one. You can even do the same thing with refinancing, which is the next pro on our list. So if you do find a home that you are in love with that you can afford right now, you can lock it in right now. And then if rates ever fall to a level where it makes financial sense to refinance, you can just do that. So you don't really have to feel bad locking in a higher rate because you aren't 100% tied to it. It can always change. And the last pro is that the sooner you buy, you actually start building up equity in your house. All right, let's talk about the cons of buying now. Well, there's always two sides to every coin, isn't there? So if you lock in a mortgage rate now, you do have to refinance in the future, which some people might view as negative because of the work it takes, and it might not make financial sense to do so unless the rates drop by a lot. The second con is that if you're buying now and it's not your dream home, perhaps a better home might come on the market in a few months and you just never know. And a third con of buying now is that the housing market and prices could still come down further. So if you buy now and the housing market in your region, say, cools off, you might be buying at a high. Still though, if you're buying a house to live in for a longer period of time, let's say 8, 10, 15, or 20 years, you'll always have some optionality in terms of refinancing, hopefully. And also you mitigate some market risk over time because homes tend to appreciate, at least in most areas. All right, so for waiting until 2025, there are some pros and cons to waiting as well. So we're going to talk about them. And as you might actually notice, some of these are direct opposites of the pros and cons of buying now. So the first pro of waiting is that you have the potential for lower rates. Perhaps the Federal Reserve lowers rates even to 3.5% or 3%. That means a ton of savings for you later on down the line if you were patient enough to actually wait for those rate cuts. A second pro is that you had a lot more capital as of right now, which means you have more time to save until 2025, which means that you could probably get a nicer house later on or perhaps invest that money. Third, there is a possibility of more inventory as rates fall because many sellers are going to be paying more attention to the market and they might be less hesitant to list their homes, especially as interest rates fall. And of course, let's talk about the cons. So con number one is that if home prices rise while you wait, then the overall savings from a lower interest rate in the future may not outweigh the increase in home prices. This is pretty region and market dependent, but that's why I think these decisions are so tough. Con number two is that you still pay rent while you wait, so I think there is a trade-off there. And con number three is that, well, we don't actually know if the Fed will actually cut rates or not, so you could just be waiting a lot longer than expected. If you aren't flexible and you need a home immediately, let's just say you had 2 kids and perhaps your partner is like, hey, we gotta buy a house. Perhaps waiting isn't a great option for you because overall you might prefer that stability. Now, what's my personal decision and takeaway here? So for me, I've done a lot of work on calculating what I can afford right now based on the mortgage rates, and knowing how much I have saved, I personally just want to save some more money and make some more money while my rent remains relatively cheap. I also live in San Francisco, where it's much more favorable to rent than to buy, because buying a similar property of the one I'm in right now would cost me close to double what I am paying now in rent, and I don't think that makes much sense. So according to this SF Chronicle article, quote, in the San Francisco metropolitan area, the median home price was nearly twice as much as the 20-year rent, $1.2 million compared to $609,000, which is a ratio of 1.9. That was the second highest price to rent ratio among the 100 most populous US metros for which Zillow and Apartment List have data. So that's just me in particular. I'm personally going to wait until 2025. Let me see if there's going to be some future rate cuts, hopefully. Now, your factors and personal finance situation could be completely different than mine, and also your region will make a huge difference as well. For example, let's pretend you have a stable job, you just had a couple kids, and you want to settle down in the same location for a while, and if you feel like you can afford a mortgage payment plus the home insurance, etc., perhaps you're ready for home ownership right now. I think that's especially true if you live in a really high demand area for real estate. So for example, in the Bay Area, homes tend to appreciate a lot. If you're able to get in now in the Bay Area, it might be worth it to lock it in right now versus waiting. However, if you live somewhere else in America where perhaps the appreciation just doesn't have such a great track record, then you might want to wait. When it comes to owning a home versus even renting a home, you always need to think critically about your own personal financial situation and try to make the best decision with the data that's available to you. If you're wondering how much of a home you can afford, because you should do that work yourself, make sure to check out my video on that exact subject right here. We dive into it in a really simple and effective way, and if you enjoyed this video, you definitely need that one to make a better decision. So I will see you guys in that video or a future one on this channel. Thank you for being here. Peace.